Hi, my name is Pip and this is my review of Alex McKinnon's book, Unbroken. If you've never heard of Alex McKinnon before, he used to play for the Newcastle Knights, which is a rugby team in New South Wales and Australia. And in 2014, he was involved in a tackle. And in that tackle, they lifted him off the ground a little bit and things started to go pear-shaped and he couldn't correct his own body position and they continued lifting, and it ended in a situation where he tucked his head kind of instinctively. When your face is planting towards the ground, you want to shield your face. And the trouble with that was that he and 2 or 3 big rugby players landed on his neck, and now he's a tetraplegic, which is kind of like quadriplegia, but he does have some use of his arms, but it's pretty limited use. He has come such a long way and he can now stand for periods, but at the end of this book he says that he couldn't initiate the stand on his own, but once he was up he could stand for a while himself. I believe he managed to stand for 45 minutes when he got married, which was wonderful. And yeah, 2014 was a tricky year in Australian sport because Phil Hughes was also hit by a cricket ball to the neck and he died as a result of that. So in 2014 there was a lot of conversation about sporting safety and safety gear and also insurance coverage for players to make sure that when they suffer these catastrophic injuries that they're actually properly supported. I don't follow rugby. I don't really much care about the NRL, but I very much remember when he was tackled and it was massive news in Australia and everyone was wondering, like with Phil Hughes, how is he going to be tomorrow? How is he going to be the next day? And unfortunately for Phil, yeah, well, the situation is... Anyway, so this is actually a self-published book. I didn't realize that. I have long thought that this would have been published by a publisher. I would have thought there would definitely be a market for it in Australia. Maybe there was, maybe the contract was dodgy, I don't know. But this is a self-published book and I worked that out reasonably quickly because it does kind of have an unusual format. So some of the chapters are barely 3 pages long, mostly barely 4 pages long. There are obviously some chapters that are 7 or 8 pages, but they're fairly short chapters. And after a while you start to notice that each paragraph is about 1 to 2 sentences. And in many cases that doesn't need to be the case. There were also a few typos and things like that. Not many, but I just think it's because I'm just exiting an editing phase of my own novel that I notice that more because my brain's more in that mindset. It's still a very interesting book. Apart from the first chapter, it's probably about the first half of the book is all stories of his childhood and his early exposure to rugby and him playing a lot of rugby when he was 15, 16. And then the early phases of getting a contract and the progression to getting to the Newcastle Knights, which is all very relevant, but as someone who's not super interested in rugby, I did start to skim read a little bit through some chapters. And I found the odd chapters where they were struggling to make 3 or 4 pages. Sometimes I thought it maybe would have been just better to leave that chapter out, but again that could be because I'm in an editing frame of mind. But there were definitely things that you read this book and you think, it just makes you think. So there's a part where he's talking about his prognosis and the information he's given at hospital, and they really can't give him any straight answers, but his MRI looks normal. And how frustrating that must be to have, you know, your MRI come back and you're looking for damage so that you can get an indication of how serious your injury is, but you can't actually see any damage, but you know that there is damage because you can't use your arms and legs. And how emotionally challenging it must be for him to be recognized by people, and then when they come up and ask him for his signature and he can't hold a pen. Alex goes through his experience at mostly at Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney and then at Royal Ride Rehab. And he spends a lot of time with the physios, and it does make me worry for my profession a little bit, that you just... like, I mean, these physios are certainly more trained than a lot of others in those areas, but the idea that no one told him what rehab would actually be like when he's an elite athlete. He would be assuming that someone would be working with him for hours and hours every day. But in reality, when you go to hospital or you go to a rehab hospital, and it sounds like, I was surprised he got as much rehab as he did at Royal Ride Rehab, because I've been there, and it's kind of this, well, it's more set up for like neurological injuries and things like that, but it's still like a rehab facility. And essentially at most of those places, you're lucky to see the physio twice a day. Usually you be seeing them for maybe an hour, maybe. And that's because they've got to get around and see a bunch of other people. But like his experience at Royal North Shore Hospital, where he's, you know, he's a 22-year-old guy, like left sitting naked on the toilet for an hour because there's only one person who can do the toileting of people, and they're bouncing between 3 people. Like, you know, just why don't we have the facilities where we have enough nursing staff that someone with a spinal injury doesn't have to sit naked on the toilet when they have temperature control issues for an hour on end, you know? Like, it just blows my mind. And yet I was a patient at, well, I have been a patient at North Shore Public, but there are some things that you understand after working in a hospital that really need to be changed, and there are some things that you experience as a patient in the hospital that really need to be changed. And it just makes me sad that when it's as serious as a spinal injury and you've got such a small window of opportunity to remake nerve connections and things like that, that they aren't going after it more aggressively. I remember being a junior physio and getting a yearly placement contract when you left uni, and hoping that I wasn't placed at Royal North Shore because I was terrified of the idea of having to work with spinal injuries because I don't want to stuff it up. But like, also now I'm kind of the perspective of it wasn't as hardcore as I thought it was, and maybe it should be as hardcore as I thought it was. Anyway, so that was very interesting and confronting. Then when he gets towards the end of the book, he's still clearly very angry about what happened in terms of the tackle and what the opposition's captain Cameron Smith said in the immediate kind of on-field moments, where Cameron Smith argued that Melbourne Storm had experienced a few lift tackles of their own that evening, and essentially that it wasn't their fault if someone ducked their head, and therefore that led to a spinal injury. Which, I mean, if you watch the footage, he doesn't say it in a super aggressive way, but I can understand why McKinnon is pissed. The camera died. So there is actually this section where he talks about kind of the realities of his situation, and that the financial stresses are something that you can't even escape while you're lying in the hospital bed in those early weeks. And he worked out that based on rough estimates, if he lived for another 50 years, the cost of living expenses would exceed $10 million. And in order to get out of bed, take a shower, and get dressed each morning, it would cost him $82,000 each year to pay for a carer to help him. And I mean, that's really confronting to think that to have a shower and get dressed in the morning, it's going to cost you $82,000 a year, unless you want to turn your partner into your carer. which he clearly is adamantly against doing, which I completely understand. So I think this is the type of book that is going to be of interest to, for example, someone like me who has a physio background, who worked in hospitals, who knows what it's like, who has dealt with neurological issues, nothing this severe, with patients before, someone who's in the medical field, that sort of thing. And I think this book would be of interest to a lot of Australians because a lot of us remember 2014. We remember Alex McKinnon getting injured. We remember Phil Hughes. It was a crazy year in sport and a very sad year in sport. And I think if you love rugby and you love the NRL, then this is worth a read. I didn't actually realize, like I said, that it was self-published, so now I feel kind of bad that I didn't buy it, that I borrowed it from the library, because this is one of his means of supporting himself for the rest of his life. And I think it's very brave that he has done this and put it out there. And it is an interesting read. My only problem with it is I'm not that interested in the early football side of things. But then, you know, as I've said before, I'm not really interested in like the childhood part of life with a lot of biographies. I love tennis and I am a mad Rafa Nadal fan. And even the similar chapters in his book, I was skim reading. So it's just, I'm not a particular fan of the stories of endless training and dedication. And I mean, I feel that could be condensed more, but that's personal preference. But Alex McKinnon most certainly has a story to tell, and it's an interesting story, and it's a very moving story, and obviously very emotion filled for him. And one of the rare things that is in this book that you don't find in a lot of books, because it gets filtered out often by publishers and professional editors and all of that sort of thing, is the raw emotion. And there is raw emotion in this book. So if that sounds appealing to you, definitely check out this book, and definitely check out Alex McKinnon on social media and things like that. And just keep an eye on his story and see if there are ways you can support him. And remember that following people like Alex on social media enables them to also have an income. So he can potentially then use that for advertising and things like that, which is a way for him to generate income and support his family, which is really very, very important. So do check out Alex's story, do check out his social media, and don't forget to like this video and to let me know in the comments below what you thought.